least have a chance of making it.
If everyone could please take seats. We will now recognize our second panel. Mr. Scott Stanford is Operations Manager of Royal Offshore, Royal Production Company, Inc. Mr. Mark Leland is Senior Vice President of Offshore Wind Projects for Bayox Corporation. Mr. Roland Maurer is President and Chief Executive Officer of Corpus Christi Regional Development Corporation. And Mr. Robert Parker is President of Repcon, Inc. If you were here, and I think you all were for the first, then you very much know that the committee rules require that you be sworn. Would you please rise to take the oath? And raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Let the record indicate that all answered in the affirmative. Please take seats. Now, I'm going to apologize in advance. We took a lot of time on the first panel, and it was very informative. We're going to be a little bit quicker on the second panel, so please try to summarize so that by the time the red light comes on, you're done with your opening statement so we have time for questions. And with that, we'll set the green panel. We now recognize Mr. Stanford for his opening statement, for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm here today to represent Royal Production Company, more specifically Royal
Can you pull the
Offshore.
mic just a little closer?
Can you hear me? Yeah, the focus of my discussion today is centered on the Gulf of Mexico and the policies that have been put into effect over the last 18 months by virtue of the events that happened in the summer of 2010. Deepwater Horizon has changed the scope of how we operate, and I'm coming more from a perspective of direct operations have done that for the last 20 years and kind of give you a glimpse of what the life is like as an operator in the Gulf of Mexico in today's times. I'll give you some examples of some of the policies that we deal with every day. But specifically, they're centered around the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, Regulatory and Enforcement, BOEMRE, nowadays usually referred to as the MMS previously, and the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement, the BSEE. Those are the two agencies that we deal with specifically.
And they're basically MMS renamed.
They're basically MMS renamed under the Department of Interior. One of the newest changes is a safety and environmental management system. It's called SIMS. It was put in place and mandated by all operators to be put in place by November 15th of last year. It was a monumental effort for the most part for a lot of small independents like us. It's a very complex and taxing program. It takes a large amount of resources and commitment to implement. It's based on a reporting and policing type of system. It's made up of 13 elements, and each element has hundreds of pages of policies to deal with every day. Basically, the core of the attempt is to qualify each and every individual that's on your platform or working for you on a rig and maintain their certifications, understand their training, and their whereabouts all the time. And that reporting goes on each and every day. So in order for a company like Royal to maintain a policy and a procedure and a program like that, it takes a lot of input, a lot of involvement from a lot of people. Over the last 12 months alone, we've probably spent over $200,000 in 12 months just to try to implement it. We contract 2 layers of different regulatory consultants to administer it, and the net result is a significant increase to our operating cost. It goes to the bottom line. Royal, like a majority of others, operates on a long history of safe operating practices long before SIMS was implemented. So, prior to SIMS, there were other policies that were implemented by the federal government, including Subpart O, the Oil Spill Response Plan, the annual facility inspections, annual performance measures, topside, underwater inspections, and many, many more. Also were part of the safety and environmental pieces of our day-to-day life in the Gulf of Mexico. This is new. It takes the place of some of those. It duplicates a lot of those. But it is a big volume effort of reporting. And with that becomes new inspections, new need for inspectors, which forces the BSEE into hiring. And so with the new hiring comes new fees to our industry in the form of direct fees to the wells and the platforms individually. New personnel that are being hired by these agencies are pretty limited in training. They have a very short training program, and for the most part, a lot of them have no industry experience at all, which is a cause of a problem for us on a daily basis. Another example of new policy is the drilling permits. Everybody reads about them. The moratorium that was put in place on the hills of Macondo affected Royal and its partners in a well that we were drilling in deep water. We were 75% complete on that well. I had already drilled to 15,000 feet and had already sunk $45 million into that well when we were told to suspend it. And so we had to put temporary abandoned cement plugs in the well. We had to release the well. We had to re-permit, put new permits in place. And all of this is at a spread rate of about $500,000 a day, $500,000 a day. So we spent 18 months with $45 million of some cost that we had no utility for, no well that could produce and have revenues. So in order to get the well resumed in drilling, a new permitting program had to be put in place, and a new rig contract had to be put in place. That new rig contract came with a $10 million risk. In order to get one of the few rigs to move back on that location, they had only a small time slot. And that time slot was predicated on risking $10 million to hit a date. If your permit wasn't in by that date, then you had to be penalized by virtue of $10 million. Our permits took in the order of 18 months to receive. We actually got back on the well, but in the midst of doing so, it came with a new price tag. The price tag went from $45 million to $70 million. So, we added $25 million to the cost of the well by virtue of having to move off of it, move back on it, and reestablish production with, or drilling with a new casing design. So with that is all part of a new policy that requires worst case discharge calculations, BOP shear ram calculations, updates of your spill response plans. All the rigs have to be identified that can drill a relief well, and there has to be P certifications for every. So at the end of the day, your new permit ends up being about 2 to 3 inches thick. It takes a lot of review time, a lot of preparation time, at a great cost to everybody. It goes beyond just the drilling of a well. It affects all activity in the Gulf of Mexico, whether it's a coiled tubing unit or a hydraulic workover unit. Anything that has a BOP with it has to be recertified. And every time that you have a procedural change in your permits, you have to resubmit and recertify all these elements by a certified engineer. Each one of those resubmittals along the way, even if it's an ordinary change, takes time. And the review process may be 24, 48 hours. All of our operations in the Gulf of Mexico run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They don't shut down for nights or weekends. So we spend somewhere between $100,000 to $500,000 a day. And so every time you make an ordinary change in your procedure and you have to get it re-permitted, it's inefficient and it's costly. And we just got through last year doing a decommissioning program that ended up costing twice as much money, twice as long because of that. We had one well in particular that we had to resubmit 5 times after it was initially approved, and one of those 5 times there was a iteration that happens 3 times. There's no longer an interface between the district level for permitting to talk about options, and at the end of the day, it leads to a great inefficiency because you just have to offer your options, get them rejected, offer them again. And the whole time it has to be recertified. So that inefficiency is percolated its way through everybody's activities. Another example is idle iron. It's a new policy. If it meets the definition of no further use for operations, you have to take platforms and wells out of the Gulf of Mexico. In essence, it sounds like a good thing, but in reality, real estate in the Gulf of Mexico is very important. What might be used one day by one operator is very valuable to another operator that might be right next to it in a block that needs a structure to operate off of. So, in essence, you're taking the chance of taking out relatively new facilities that possibly could be used, especially new facilities that meet modern standards. So to me, that's an issue. So in summation, I gave a few examples of what daily life's like working with the regulatory arms of the federal government. But I'd like to see the government provide companies with a way to compete on an equal basis. If you're a small operator, it's really hard to take all these extra costs and distribute them over a finite revenue cash flow, as opposed to a very large company that can do that a little bit better. So the playing field to me has been shifted because of the new policies. They're so excessive that there needs to be a large staff in order to deal with them. And so I encourage the BOMER to add staff, add good staff, raise their salaries, hire highly qualified people that we can deal with and train them correctly. And I think that would help our industry considerably. But, instead of taxing us on new fees, I think that ought to come out of the existing royalty structures that are already there. So, in essence, I think the entire operating group in the Gulf of Mexico was penalized by one event. Everybody was characterized as possibly being negligent, and now the repercussions are very big government putting in a lot of policies and a lot of policing that is a giant burden on our industry, and I think that it needs to be changed in a way that helps promote our basin for discovery, not one that prevents people from being able to afford to be there.
Thank you. Mr. Leyland.
Yes, good morning. First, I'd like to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for inviting me to testify today. And as you can probably tell, I come from a long way east of Texas, but it really is an honor to be invited here today.
Texas is a very big state.
It is a very big state, but I come a long way from a long way east of Texas, although I do have family relations with Texas from '68. Baryonyx, as it's pronounced, which is an old dinosaur, by the way, is actually a Texas registered company, and it was established in 2008 and is actually based in Austin. Most of its senior management come from long backgrounds in the offshore oil and gas industry, and our CEO, Ian Hatton, and I were involved in the development of the most innovative offshore wind farm in the world, the Ormond wind farm, which we took through permitting and design, engineering, and all right the way through to financial close. And interestingly, in the context of the oil and gas discussions that we've had this morning, It was actually originally conceived and planned as a hybrid project, which sought to balance the variability of wind by using offshore gas turbines from stranded gas to generate power and use the spare capacity in the transmission asset to export that power ashore. So it was an interesting development. Normand was also the first offshore wind commercial development using 5 megawatt turbines, which are about twice as big as anything you've seen onshore. And it was the first to use classic oil and gas type jackets as its foundations. And interestingly enough, it was the first to be delivered on budget and on time. And whereas I'm sure Ian and I would love to be able to claim credit for that significant achievement, I think we'd be the first to admit that that was probably down to the project management team we had alongside us, which not surprisingly came from, you've got it, the oil and gas industry. And with that success behind us, we are asked when we go back to the UK, why did you go to Texas? Why offshore Texas? And I guess it's a legitimate question. We've heard an awful lot about the gas that's out, that exists in Texas, and people ask us that question. And it was a positive choice, and it was based on our understanding of what it takes to actually make offshore wind viable. And I guess it can be summed up under a few very brief headings. Firstly, we have the leasing process, and we've heard today about the submerged lands of Texas extending to 3 marine leagues, which is kind of a quaint British European type measuring stick, or 9 nautical miles, 10.4 statute miles, or about 16.3 kilometers. Pick whichever measuring stick you want. And this enables developers within the state to apply for leases from the General Land Office, the Texas General Land Office. There's no federal involvement at all in this. And basically, the responsibility, as you've heard from the previous panel, rests with the state. And the process is we lease from the General Land Office, which under the stewardship of Jerry Patterson has been very supportive throughout the whole process. And we currently hold about 67,000 acres of the submerged lands to develop offshore wind. Within state waters, the permitting authority is very clearly defined. It doesn't fall under any federal authority at all. It falls under the jurisdiction, well, it does. It's the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers are a federal agency, but it isn't under the MMS or it's whatever it's become. It's merged and morphed into. So basically, they run a process which has been proven through the oil and gas industry, and we're able to take advantage of that. It's a very straightforward process and it's clear. But basically, why again with offshore wind are we coming to offshore Texas? An awful lot is made about, everybody hears all the time about the offshore wind industry off the East Coast and things like that. But if you actually look at a map of offshore wind, there's a very nice resource which exists between Corpus Christi and Brownsville that blows very reliable and every day in a very useful format. And I call it Windy Crescent. It's about the only bit of the Gulf which is actually like this, but it does have tremendous potential. The wind resource is excellent, the profile is reliable, and basically, simply, the wind blows when the power is needed. It blows in the afternoon when the demand on the system exists. Onshore wind isn't quite like that. But most importantly, the oil and gas legacy of Texas is something where I believe that we have a major contribution, where a major contribution to the success of offshore wind will come from. Basically, offshore wind is an offshore construction project. And offshore construction really belongs in the Gulf of Mexico. When I set foot on a brown root barge in 1974 in the North Sea, and that barge was built in, I think it was Livingston Shipyard in Houston, I think. Yeah. And basically, if you look at what Texas has, it has the engineering and design houses, project management teams, like the one I said was basically resulted in the successful delivery of Ormond. Fabrication yards are out there, the ports and harbors, the marine construction legacy, all those things are there. And the message to me, from my perspective, is clear. If Texas can demonstrate that you can build assets off the coast of Texas in the Gulf of Mexico, then it can also provide those services to any and all the developments up the Atlantic coast. We're talking about developing a maximum of about 3 gigawatts of power from our leases, but the federal government wants to install 10 gigawatts by 2020, 54 gigawatts by 2030. And the scale of the potential market is absolutely staggering for offshore construction. The development of offshore wind has very little to do with green energy in Europe. This has everything to do with energy security as we move into the 21st century. Oil and gas quite rightly should remain at the heart of the energy solution, but by offering a basket of generating methodologies is absolutely imperative. In Europe, we did the dash for gas in the 1990s, and we're now importing gas from Russia, Qatar, and places like this, and they do, quite rightly, as you said, Chairman, sit their hand on a spigot and turn it off if you attempt to vote the wrong way in the United Nations. So natural gas and wind are complementary. They are not in opposition. They are absolutely complementary. So I come from the oil and gas industry offshore, and I seriously believe that. And they form the cornerstone of what is a very reliable government policy moving forwards. I'm convinced from my experience in developing projects in Europe that Texas can produce power from offshore energy more cheaply than anybody else in the US. And I think that's beyond doubt. The opportunity for Texas to lead the offshore wind industry in the new offshore construction boom is just waiting to be grasped. Texas is an energy state and an offshore construction state. It is not simply an oil and gas state. The existing infrastructure that's been built up over decades to support the oil and gas industry merely needs realigning to address this new market and the new opportunities. It remains our view that offshore wind should be viable without subsidies, and in the longer term, all forms of new generation, have always historically required some form of support, but in the long term, it should exist without subsidies. There are more platforms being taken out, as you pointed out, of the Gulf of Mexico than there are going in at the present moment. From our projects alone, we would require 50 or 60 structures to be built every year for 7 to 8 years. And this represents a tremendous opportunity for Corpus Christi and for all the construction sites around the Gulf of Mexico. So anyway, eventually, the fabrication yards can be full, the ports can be full, and we can actually bring the turbine manufacturers, the cable manufacturers, and all those support industries back into the United States, into Texas. I believe the opportunity is tremendous, and I think it just needs to be grasped. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Maurer.
Mr. Chairman,
you go to take a drink of water, we'll immediately call on you.
Mr. Chairman, Congressman Farenthold, good morning. My name is Roland Maurer. I'm the CEO of the Corpus Christi Regional Economic Development Corporation. Our mission is to strengthen the regional economy. We focus on encouraging corporate capital investment and focusing on job creation. Our funding comes from a variety of sources, including local governments, like cities and counties, the Port of Corpus Christi, and discretionary funding from the private sector. We truly appreciate the committee's interest in our region and the topic of the hearing today. Today you've heard or will hear from a wide range of business leaders from our region regarding their issues and concerns related to their specific businesses or industries. I'd like to speak from the perspective of an organization that visits over 150 existing companies in the region each year and is the primary point of contact for companies interested in doing business in the Coastal Bend. The major concerns voiced in our discussions across all industries are the increasing costs of federal regulation on industry, and maybe more importantly, the need for increased predictability in the regulatory process. Each year I have the opportunity to speak around the region and talk about economic development. I describe how I believe a market economy works in very simple terms. Investments create jobs, jobs pay wages, wages buy goods and services. In truth, it's far more complicated than that. Before an investment is made, a rigorous analysis is performed, the business planning process. Potential investments must offer appropriate returns. If they don't, the investment won't occur, the jobs won't be created, and the goods and services won't be purchased. Again, this is a simple explanation of a complex topic, but it helps illustrate a significant challenge faced by industry. Increasing regulatory costs for U.S. industries who compete in a global marketplace are placed at a disadvantage when competing with producers from other countries which do not have the same regulatory burdens or costs. The second piece of this challenge is injecting some level of regulatory predictability into the equation. Companies need to know if their projects comply with current regulations, There is some level of certainty they will be able to move forward in a timely fashion, and the rules of the game will not change. Please allow me to tie these thoughts together with the topic of the day. Our region, the Coastal Bend, is very blessed. We're tracking significant potential capital investments and job creation opportunities. Our ability to realize the benefits of these potential projects is limited in some ways by the increasing regulatory burden and the lack of predictability in the regulatory process. In closing, let me share a couple data points. In the past year, our metropolitan statistical area, which is Nueces, San Patricio, and Aransas County, added over 7,800 jobs. Our 12-county region added over 11,000 jobs. Most of the job growth in the region this year can be attributed to the activity surrounding the Eagle Ford Shale. If we can stabilize the costs or the regulatory burden and increase the regulatory predictability, our job creation numbers will increase significantly. With your help,
I told you we had to hurry.
I need your help. With your help, our offshore industry can get back to work, and our local refining and chemical companies will continue to invest and hire in our region. I thank you for the opportunity to share my thoughts and would be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Parker. And I'm convinced the lights are just because we don't have enough wind power. Mr. Parker.
Chairman Isa, Congressman Farenthold, I'm Bob Parker. I'm the president of Repcon Incorporated. We're a local industrial contractor headquartered here, but we work in 34 states. We work primarily for the refining, petrochemical, and midstream oil and gas sectors of the economy. We're a little bit different than most of the other people that have talked today because we're a service provider as opposed to an actual owner or operator. But our whole livelihood is tied directly to the energy industry. Clearly, from earlier discussions and from your own research, Texas and South Texas is a leader in oil and gas production and is a critical part of our economy, and I think everyone recognizes that. There are thousands and thousands of Texas jobs that are provided by the owners and operators and their supporting contractors, suppliers, vendors in South Texas. So the multiplier on what the refining and petrochemical plants and the energy industry in general do in Texas is multiplied by a factor of 20 or 30 in most cases. The energy industry cares, which is something that you don't hear often out of Washington, you don't hear often from the environmental side of the house. The energy industry cares about the environment, they care about safety. I can sit here and testify without a doubt that the owners that we work for put safety and environmental protection above everything else in their facilities. It's above production, it's above profits. We have to do it, they know we have to do it, and they expect their contractors and service providers to be the same way. Over the last 5 years, sulfur levels have been reduced by approximately 90%. And this brings up something, just because something is technologically feasible does not mean it's economically viable or it's something we should do. They have spent tremendous money to the tune of probably $40 to $50 billion as an industry to reduce sulfur, to reduce greenhouse gases. To get that last 10% may take an equal amount of money. So we believe that every single regulation, every single law should have a cost-benefit analysis done on it to determine whether it is worth the cost. Again, just because it's feasible or technically able to be done doesn't mean it's something we should be done. The energy industry has been under attack, and the policies of this administration, at least from our perspective, are the most onerous on business, on free enterprise, and on the energy industry of any administration in my lifetime. I have actually been in the refining and petrochemical business since 1971. So about 40 years we have seen numerous administrations and EPA regulations come and go. But this is the most concentrated attack on the energy business that I can recall in my lifetime. During the last 20 years, there's been approximately 60 refineries that have shut down. A large number of them shut down because margins were not sufficient to support the requirements and upgrades that were being required by the regulations. Unfortunately, when the oil and gas industry is weakened because of shutdowns, it not only impacts their employees, it impacts the entire South Texas area, and the United States. It also impacts our national security. At a time when we have more and more of our oil that comes from countries and states that are not necessarily friendly to the United States, that is a prime reason we should be drilling and producing our own and being less dependent on sources that could be cut off at some future time. There's also regulation outside of the energy industry that applies to the business, and I realize this particular focus is on the energy industry, but as a contractor, I wanted to speak briefly about some of the overreaching that is going on. The National Labor Relations Board has basically recently been reconstituted during a one-day recess appointment. It is the most anti-merit shop, anti-free enterprise NLRB that we have had. They have quit being a neutral arbiter and a neutral forum for solving labor disputes, and they come down clearly on the side of the organized labor section. Whether it's ambush elections, card check, in every case, the items that the NLRB is pushing will be detrimental to our business and to most of the non-union business. Texas is a right-to-work state. There were 4 states recently passed laws guaranteeing the right to a secret ballot during a union election. The NLRB is challenging them. They file preemptive lawsuits against them. This is something that is just an indication of the amount of red tape and the amount of regulation that this administration has for business. In short, I think the regulation is stifling jobs, it's reducing output, dragging the economy, and I believe it's threatening not only the economy of the United States, but the security of the United States long term. Thank you.
Thank you. And this committee has held a number of hearings, both before and after the recess appointments. So we're very concerned that the actions of the NLRB will not, in fact, be lawful. That just as happened in previous times, they've had to undo decision after decision. Now, it sounds like in your case, undoing those decisions may not be all bad. But I think I'm going to be brief, and then I'm going to concentrate on Mr. Stanford, and then Blake, I think, will concentrate more broadly. It sounds like times are good in the oil patch, but they could be better. Is that a fair statement? That, in fact, business is up, you're drilling more, but you're drilling with greater cost across the board. So in a sense, this administration, which includes, quite frankly, any credit or blame you give to the House and the Senate, is sort of living off of the fruit of very expensive oil and, in fact, $100 a barrel, and, in fact, new developments that are making yields here in the U.S. go through the roof. Is that a fair statement from all of your knowledge?
I think the Gulf of Mexico specifically has a lot of natural gas that still comes out of it, and that natural gas isn't very valuable right now. And the economic burden on top of that low cash flow from natural gas is not always profitable to everybody.
And Mr. Stanford, I wanted to follow up on your testimony because I had some specific questions. Have you sought any kind of reimbursement from the BP fund?
No.
Do you see any reason that you're not as much a victim of that spill, and then, if not BP responsible, then the government? Because one or the other apparently broke a promise to you in your deep water drilling where you had a license, you had a contract, they changed the rules, and if I understand correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong, they didn't just change the rules, they entered into we call it a permatorium, but a moratorium, so they could go think about rules they were going to write. Is that roughly what you experienced?
Exactly what we experienced, and I think it is unfair. I think that the federal government, without request, ought to review those situations, and there ought to be some compensation for that. I think it was the intent of Royal and its partners to resume drilling as fast as they possibly could, and in doing so, they focused on trying to get a new permit as opposed to reconciling what seemed to be unfair thus far.
Were any of your rig workers paid at all out of that fund, BP fund? Did any of those individuals apply?
Not that I'm aware of.
When you have a slowdown through, mostly due to the inexperiencedness of these new federal employees, where you lose a day or 2, 3, anything your employees can do other than continue drawing a salary? Is there any way to use them in any other way as a small operator?
It's purely a cost of the lease operation that affects us. And when you have somebody in a group of services.
Right, I realize that you sub some of that, but those workers, if you were a very large organization, you might be able to tell your contractor to move crews.
That's true.
My understanding is that might work for BP.
True.
It can't possibly work for you. You're just not big enough to have the kind of ability to fly crews
Absorb that.
around.
That's correct.
So many of the inefficiencies right now coming out of federal expansion hit you harder than they're going to hit a conglomerate. Is that true?
It's true.
Now, I'm going to look at the sunny side for a moment with my remaining time. If you survive, if you're able to continue borrowing and leveraging and doing everything you need to bring in your wealth, your expectation is you'll still break even or make money, right?
Our hope is, but the planned costs for a lot of offshore projects are planned and scheduled months to years before they're executed. So when new policy comes down, we have to spend twice as much money. You know, we're already engaged in the economics of that, and for the most part, it makes what would be a 2 to 3 to 1 return a break-even return.
So I just want to go final on that. You had this $50 million sunk cost, and I realize you're just talking about some of the cost that
Sure.
goes on. But let's just assume for a moment you have a $50 million project becomes a $100 million project. It was going to make $90 million to you. So instead of making a huge profit, you often hear about, the 40%, 80% return on investment, you go to a negative return of 10 million. And these numbers are unfortunately not the numbers. They're going to be larger than that in profit or loss, right?
That's correct.
Now, you drill in deep water, so you bought your lease from the federal government, right?
That's correct.
And if I'm roughly right, you're paying 17.5% of anything that comes out of that well, right?
That's exactly right.
So on $100 million, the federal government makes $17.5 million, whether or not you make a penny.
Whether we make a penny. That's
Plus,
right.
of course, your lease purchase.
That's
So I just want to make sure, that's where I said I was going to concentrate on you, because somehow, as a native Clevelander now living in California, it is sort of poetic justice that the federal government has no incentive to make you profitable. They have no incentive to do anything except collect their 17.5%, because ultimately, as long as it comes online with you, or if you don't make it, the next guy that takes it over, they're basically making the same amount, even if they make your project cost double what it should.
That's exactly right. They do not share in any of the risk of the loss, and so long as the well comes on stream, they'll make their royalty. And that's
Now I've got a potpourri of people here: EDC, independent driller, somebody who, Leland, you're lovely in the sense that you're out there even if you're not drilling. Do you believe that this committee should try to find a way to link the ultimate revenues received to the original estimate of burden placed by the government? In other words, if the federal government again changes its bargain between the start of a project and the end of a project, do you think that we should have some sort of a shared cost so that it's not all on you? Well, the federal government makes, in that hypothetical example, 17.5 million and you lose 10?
I would love it. And the reason...
I was actually asking the others too, because I figured you were a given. But Leland, you wouldn't be part of that directly, but indirectly you would. If they make putting green energy up in the Gulf much more difficult, your project might go from a profit to a loss, but meantime, you're still renting, right?
I think that's true, but we are safe. We're inside state waters, so we thanks be to Texas, we're kind of immune from that. But I think
I wasn't going to suggest on behalf of Texas, because the Railroad Commission already left, but but that, you know, if they were the problem, I'd suggest they share in the solution too.
Well, yes, I think that's true. And we do get a lot of support from the state, you know, a lot of encouragement anyway.
My time's expired. I just briefly, would you say that should be a scheme we try to do on behalf of the American people?
We try to get that in with our clients. If they change the rules after a contract is let, we expect to be able to go to them.
You
to
get paid for
compensate
change
them.
orders?
We believe in change orders.
Jeez, I always try to avoid that.
I'm a contractor. I have to believe in change orders.
Yeah, I know, you lose a little money until the first change order.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Mr. Farrenholt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Stanford, as a result of what you've gone through and seen, do you think we're creating an environment where only the majors can play in deep water? Are y'all going to continue to deep water, or?
I think that the playing field is not level anymore. I think the major companies have an advantage just by virtue of the amount of resources they have and the amount of revenue that comes from that. The distribution of those costs are more proportional than they are to us. So yeah, I think there is a shift of advantage there.
And you're talking about all of the money that it's costing you, and in fact it's costing the federal government some money to implement all of these new rules and regulations. I'm concerned that we're taking the wrong approach to this. Obviously, we've got to ensure safety, but the Gulf of Mexico isn't just United States waters. It also includes waters controlled by Cuba and Mexico, in which no matter how many regulations we pile on folks operating in U.S. waters or on U.S. companies, it's not going to have a lick of effect on the Cubans or the Mexicans. Do you think it might be a better use of the resources to develop spill responses and technologies and training for people to respond for whenever when this happens again in non-U.S. waters, be it in the Gulf of Mexico, the Arctic, or anywhere else in the world?
I think it would be a benefit. The Bay of Campeche is not very far from here, and it polluted Texas beaches, you know, in the 1970s, and that lingered for many, many, many years. So I can only see that would be a benefit.
And then I think you were also talking about pulling, when you're done, having to remove the rigs and the value of the real estate in the Gulf of Mexico. Do you find, y'all do some shallow water too, or you just?
Sure we do.
Do you find, especially in the shallow water, that you tend to have fishing boats around your rigs?
Always.
And
That's the best.
so they're kind of creating artificial reefs and wildlife habitats.
Right.
Does it make sense that we're requiring, when we're spending money to sink Navy ships to make artificial reefs, we're requiring oil companies to spend money to remove reefs that they'd rather abandon in place?
I do. I think that the number of platforms that are turned to reefs is much less than it used to be. It used to be a component you could negotiate, especially off the state of Louisiana. But there's a big benefit to that. My issue is with relatively young, modern platforms that meet current qualifications that have to be taken out because they've lapsed a few months of being useful, when it could be useful to somebody else. And that's important in development.
Okay. Mr. Parker, you do turnarounds for refineries, but you're not building any new refineries, are you?
There has not been a new refinery built since 1978 in the U.S. There have been some large expansions, primarily over in Garyville, Louisiana. There was a large expansion by Marathon, and in Beaumont, Port Arthur area, Motiva did a big expansion. But beyond that, most all of the capital expenditures have been for diesel, hydrodesulfurization to meet the low sulfur diesel and gasoline requirements, which contributes not a dime to the bottom line of the refining and petrochemical plants. It's strictly a cost of doing business.
And we're at or near capacity in our refineries now nationwide. Is that an accurate statement?
Yes, I mean, those type projects, the ones that are environmental related, are simply so they can keep operating. They don't do anything for the bottom line.
Do you think there's a chance we'll ever get some more refineries in the U.S.? Would this cheap natural gas overcome the regulatory costs of building one here? Or are we just done
I think there's a possibility that, assuming the natural gas stabilizes at a low dollar, you could see some possible new ethylene crackers come in, more on the petrochemical side of the business than on the refining side.
And for people with environmental concerns about these refineries, would any refinery built in the United States be cleaner than a refinery built anywhere else in the world?
You know, I can't speak for 100% of the refineries in some of Europe, the European countries, but I can tell you that compared to a lot of the third world countries, Vietnam, India, China, our refineries are substantially more modern in terms of environmental controls.
All right, and Mr. Maurer, could you talk a little bit about what the abundance of relatively low-cost natural gas and wind energy that keep our electricity affordable how is this making your job easier? What are you seeing more interest in? What type of industries are we looking at, and what kind of job and wages are we looking at in those industries?
Power is very important. Land, water, power, people. That's what you do in economic development. You sell land, water, power, and people. But we have those assets. The projects we're tracking now, we report monthly to a board of directors. The numbers are almost staggering in terms of the investment and the jobs of projects that are looking at this region. And it's across the board. I would say generally it looks like industry we have in the region today, but we're certainly seeing some new industries come into the marketplace. Natural gas is really important. When you look at the competitive environment, when companies are looking to site a facility, they may get better power in another state. We offset that with lower gas prices. They may have better property taxes in another state. We offset that with a 45-foot channel. So it's having a balance of, the balance of our assets. It's once again a competition. The natural gas, I think, sways things to our advantage. So.
If I have time for one more question,
Of
Mr.
course.
Chairman, I wanted to ask Mr. Parker. You operate across the country doing these turnarounds. These refineries want to be turned around quick. How many people does your company employ?
Today we have about 3,000 working in some 30 states. They're all based out of the Gulf Coast, and the majority of those, probably 2,300 of them, are Texas.
Are you having trouble finding good people, or are you getting good people?
We absolutely have trouble finding good people, and this is something that really probably wasn't the topic of this hearing, but the fact that a lot of people, we have employees that are ex-employees that are drawing unemployment. They won't come back to work for us unless we can guarantee them 3 months worth of work. So if we have a month job or a month and a half job, they'd rather just stay on unemployment. That is hurting us. The other thing is we have a lot of trouble, and I would venture to say the drilling companies do too, finding employees who can pass the drug test. That is a major problem, not only in Texas, but when we work in California, Washington, everywhere we go.
And typically, what does somebody who works for you make?
Anywhere, we have Boilermakers that make $70,000, $80,000 a year on up to $140,000, $150,000.
All right, thank you very much.
And we are a merit shop contractor, by the way.
Thank you.
Well, I appreciate your going into areas besides just directly energy, because one of the reasons that we do field hearings is to get more than just what you hear inside Washington. I would like to follow up just briefly, very briefly, slightly off track of energy. We are going to be periodically reconsidering the 99-week federal unemployment. How would that impact an area like this? You have low unemployment here by comparison to the national average. You're different parts of the state, but you're in the 6s and 7s or even sometimes lower. How do you view the effects of, as employers particularly, the effects of the federal policy of this 2-year unemployment? How does it affect your ability to get the workers? You sort of started on that, Mr. Parker.
I truly believe, this is a personal belief, that if you don't give people an incentive for going back to work, they're not, regardless of all of the discussions out of Washington, that all these people really want a job. If you can make $30,000 a year sitting at home watching television, or you can go out and work a lot of people choose the other. I think the thing that we could do to really improve the employment situation is to reduce the amount of unemployment benefit.
Now, you mentioned the 1 month versus 3. How do you account for that? You know, people won't come back unless you can guarantee them 3 months.
They just feel that unless we can guarantee them, you know, like a permanent job. And our work, we're a contractor. When we have a lot of work, we hire a lot of people. When we don't, we lay off. So our work is cyclical. But these guys have been doing this work for 25 years, but the fact that now they can be, for 99 weeks, they can actually sit at home, that doesn't mean they're not working. It just means they're working maybe not on the records.
Well, that's what I was getting to, isn't there sort of a secondary market that builds up when hardworking people over a period of time are taking, as you say, the 34,000 plus do either abating costs by working around the home and projects or actually earning in some other way?
Absolutely, that's what I was alluding to.
Well, I appreciate all of your comments. What I said to the first panel, I'll say to you. We would appreciate your additional thoughts that come out of this. We are going to hold a number of other energy-related hearings, and the one that we know will be in the series, but in Washington, will be a geopolitical one about the impact of being able to be a supplier of energy rather than a net consumer. And so any thoughts that any of you have on it, as American citizens or as people knowledgeable of just how much power potentially is coming online that can be, energy I should say, that can be made part of the world market, we'd appreciate your thoughts. In addition to that, the record will stay open long enough to get any other comments and quite frankly for everyone to get back and let the members know what they missed by not being here. I want to, well, you can applaud in a second for all of our panelists, but I do want to thank the audience. You've been applauding when you thought it was right very nicely, and it's been a very congenial hearing. And particularly, I want to thank the people who brought young children or not so young children to learn from today's civics lesson, if you will. And with that, you may applaud. We stand adjourned.
Great job.
Yes.